I've gotten requests from multiple teachers who watched my video on teaching gerunds and gerundives to make a similar video about teaching indirect statements. So in this video, I'm going to show you a really straightforward way to teach Latin indirect statements without even taking up extra space in your lesson plan. Salve, Justin here from the Latin Teacher Lab. Let's talk about teaching indirect statement incidentally. Remember, when we teach incidentally, what we're doing is making sure that students are exposed to the language in natural ways in the flow of class, often through regular classroom procedures. In the previous video on teaching without teaching, I gave the example of using phrases like nunc est scribendum or est tempus scribendi to indicate that it's time for your class to do something, to write, to read, whatever it may be. Now, because of the nature of indirect statement in Latin, it's really easy to incorporate into things you probably do all the time already. So how? Well, we teachers ask questions all the time. A lot of us ask simple questions in Latin in order to expose students to the language more than they might be otherwise, or in order to help students engage with the language of a text. And a little trick I started using years ago for exposing students to a ton of indirect statements and indirect questions, more on that another time, is simply instead of asking the direct version of a question, to ask something like, who knows the answer to this question? Or who thinks the answer is such and such? Let me show you what I mean. Starting with the absolute easiest way to do this, which is to go ahead and ask the direct question. Let's say, ubi est canis? Let's say you're looking at a picture that has different animals or different characters in different locations. Or let's say you're looking at a text and you're establishing the circumstances in the text. So you can go ahead and ask that direct question, ubi est canis? But then immediately prompt students with a variation of quis putat se scire? Who thinks they know, or who thinks that they know? Another variation might be quis putat se responsum scire? Who thinks they know the answer? Or quis putat se responsum dicere posse? Who thinks they can say the answer? This way, students hear that construction, that accusative plus infinitive construction that typifies Latin indirect statements, as often as you ask them a question, which can be a lot, which means students can really get the hang of it. Just tell students what you're asking when you ask these questions, and if you want how the question's put together. A common procedure for me is the first time I ask a question to go ahead and write the question down in Latin on the board, along with some English equivalent that gets the idea across. Make a brief comment on it if it feels necessary. Then continue using the question in class, and especially the first few times, follow up that Latin question with a quick question in English of what did I just ask? Or what does that question mean? Just to make sure that students are tracking. I get that confirmation from a student and then continue in Latin. Now, a quick comment on that English equivalent I referred to and how much to explain or how much not to explain at this point in students' Latin learning. If the Latin question is quis putat se scire, or quis se scire putat, quis scire se putat, then a good English equivalent is who thinks they know. But if you want to have what feels like even more direct equivalents of those forms, you can certainly say, hey, this is kind of who thinks themselves to know. That way you preserve that object and the infinitive. That's no problem. When I give an equivalent like that, like a thinks themselves to know, I find it important to point out that that sounds kind of weird in English, but putat se scire does not sound weird in Latin. In fact, it's quite normal and common. And that's part of the overall project of helping students internalize that Latin isn't coded English, and that Latin isn't inherently more formal or more stilted than English or than any other language. Latin isn't coded English, and Latin doesn't sound weird. You just got to get the hang of it. Back to the question asking. A useful variation to try sometimes is a version where instead of just asking the one question, quis putat se scire, you ask students to rate their level of knowledge or confidence on the answer to a question. This is also a way to involve the students who aren't necessarily going to be the ones who answer that specific question aloud. So what you do is, just like before, you ask that main question, ubi est canis, but then you offer a range of choices from, let's say, quis scit se scire, who knows that they know. And maybe here you have quis putat se scire, who thinks they know, same question as before. Maybe here, quis sperat se scire, hopes they know. And over here, maybe quis negat se scire, who says they don't know or who denies that they know. If you want, you can even draw up a quick table on the board of how many people fit into each category, then it becomes kind of a poll. Now, I did use the same base question of ubi est canis for this example just to keep things simple, but when I do this with students, this range of confidence, I'm less likely to do it with a really straightforward question like this, where's the dog? More likely to do it with something like, where do you see yourself living in 10 years? And then people might say, well, I really know where I want to live, or I have no idea where I want to live. That's a bit more natural in terms of the kind of communication that people do. And it also doesn't require people to say that they don't know the answer to a really straightforward question. You may have noticed that in all the sample questions so far, the accusative part of the indirect statement was just say. And that's a nice way to keep things simple and structured. It also happens to be a way to help students start to feel the usage of say. You may also have noticed that this whole procedure doesn't require students themselves to produce indirect statements when they answer. The exposure comes from how you ask the question. You can provide even more exposure, because remember, we're shooting for a lot of exposure, by repeating or affirming students' answers using an indirect statement. So far, the accusative's always been se, and the infinitive's basically always been scire. But let's say we had that question, ubi est canis, and a student answered in via, or canis in via est. Let's say your student Luisa has given that answer. You can say to the class, Luisa dicit canem in via esse. And now students have heard that indirect statement with canem as the accusative and esse as the infinitive. There are variations on that with which you can layer on even more indirect statements. You can say, Luisa canem in via esse dicit. Quis dicit responsum Luisae esse verum? Who says Luisa's answer is true? Or simply, quis hoc verum esse dicit? Who says this is true? Or quis alius? Quis alius, who else? Quis alius canem in via esse dicit? If you've tried something like this before and have an idea to share, or if you have a question about any of it, please go ahead and leave a comment below. Let's take a step back for a moment. In case you're worried about going in this direction, in case you're worried about letting go of how you tend to explicitly teach indirect statements, don't worry, none of what I've said means you can't also explicitly teach students about how indirect statement in Latin works, about that accusative plus infinitive construction, either before or after starting to do the kinds of question asking that I'm modeling here. But as you know, teaching students about something or telling students how something works is not the same as having students become comfortable with it or helping students deeply know it. For that, students need lots and lots of exposure to the construction in Latin in a way that they understand and in a context where it makes sense for that construction to occur in Latin. And they need it over time, not just in the one lesson or the one unit that's about that. They need that consistently over time. If you want that degree of learning to happen, then you need to make sure that students are exposed to any given word or construction far more than any textbook can accomplish for you. And I think most of us have recognized that as learners or teachers. This basically means that either before or after any explicit instruction, if you want that instruction not to have been in vain, you need to create exposure by using the construction yourself, either orally, like I'm demonstrating in this video, or in writing, like in a text you create that contains the construction a lot, and of course that students actually choose to read. I personally achieve a lot of that exposure through things I say in Latin for 4 really practical reasons. Number 1, it doesn't require a lot of work outside of class, the way that creating text does. You might say that it does require the work of maintaining and maybe improving my own Latin, but that's something I want to do anyway, and a desire that I hear from a lot of Latin teachers. Number 2, I found that most students are more likely to listen carefully to what I say than they are to read a text carefully, although I do have ways of fostering attentive reading that I can share in another video. Number 3, I can make the samples of language that students are exposed to in the moment more immediately relevant to students, either by basing them on information that I find out from students or by basing them on a text that we're reading right now. And number 4, it's a bit more natural for the same phrase to be repeated a lot in a group conversation. For instance, if you're asking multiple people the same question, or if multiple people are giving their opinion on something, than it is for the same phrase to be repeated a lot in a text, which can feel heavy-handed or just too repetitive. So you don't have to say things to students in Latin, but it's an incredibly efficient and often fun way to help students get the hang of just about any element of the language. And it's not actually that demanding on you as a teacher because it's so scriptable. Just like I said in the video about gerunds and gerundives, you don't need to be a comfortable Latin speaker to pull it off. Speaking of scriptability, in the video description below, I've linked a PDF with lots more examples of procedures you can use to work advanced grammar into your class. I also know there's lots more to be said about teaching indirect statements, like different combinations of tenses, for example. That's something we're talking about in the Latin Teacher Lab, where I hope you'll consider joining us. If you want me to make more videos like this and more people to see them, please go ahead and like and share this one. As always, I wish you and your students joy and success. Vale!